Robin, it's good to see you again and to be
Greetings, sir.
part of this program. I'm just back from Ethiopia, and it was a wonderful trip that I had. Two things were of great importance. One is being involved with the Global Black Center, which we can talk about at some point in time, as you're one of the major proponents of this center. And I was there, I had a visit to the Adwa Museum, which is not yet open to the public, but of course, it was the particular time, shall we say, of remembrance of the victory of Adwa in 1896, Menelik the second, and I think it was March the 2nd. So I was there just a little bit before that. So it was extremely memorable because the museum is set up and it gives a very detailed history in terms of the victory of Ethiopia over the Italians. And what was impressive was what I got from the museum was how the whole country was mobilized. As you know, there may be different ethnicities, different provinces, etc., but the whole country was mobilized. The villages, marching barefooted to go to battle, and the women, which was, absolutely, fantastic. The role that the women played, it was equal to the role that the men played. Not only did they bring provisions and provide that, there were the nurses for the wounded, etc., but they were also part of the battle, and they were there in the forefront with the warriors. So the women were equal, if not more than equal, participants in this, a great defense of the homeland. And and was displayed there in graphic detail with monuments to the different generals and video presentations. Can you take us, Robin, through some of the history, 1896?
All right, very, very simply. This was the time period when Europe was conquering Africa. Before that, Europeans were engaged in hit and run raids to enslave Africans or to do gun running operations to get Africans to enslave each other. Now, here was something new. Now they were conquering African land, taking it over. And this is the period that people call colonialism. And they were successful everywhere in Africa except Ethiopia. Now, I'm going to say a little bit about some of the other places, but I'll do that in about 10 minutes' time. But what was special about Ethiopia is the victory halted Italy's campaign to expand its colonial empire into Africa. And while the other African countries were being swallowed up, and the capitals of these African countries were being transferred to London, to Paris, to Lisbon, to Berlin, Ethiopia was able to hold out for another 40 years. Consequently, Ethiopia is said to be the only African nation to have successfully resisted European conquest during this period. And so Ethiopia became a very, very powerful symbol. So the battle took place at a site called Adwa. This is 1896, and the Ethiopians out-commanded, out-generaled, and ultimately beat the Italian army. And so Ethiopia remained a free country for the next 40 years. Now, the Italians came back, and they came back just before World War II.
Before you go to the Italians coming, well, let's go back to 1884, 1885, the Berlin Conference. Because that's what you're saying, that Europe that decided to invade and carve up Africa. That was the next phase, shall we say, after, as you mentioned, the hit and run excursions. But
Yeah.
they sat down at this conference in Berlin in 1884, 1885, and decided that they were going to take over all of Africa and divide it up among themselves. And that was part of what Italy was trying to do, was trying to gain territory. As you said, you know, France did its thing, and Spain did its thing, and Britain did its thing, you know, all over North and West and Southern Africa. And Italy wanted its territory. That's how you became prominent, shall we say, as a European power, was to gain a part of Africa. And of course, the Battle of Adwa, you know, set back certainly the Italian claim to being a power in the world. I'm sorry to interrupt that, but I just wanted to tie it in with the Berlin Conference because that's so pivotal.
Yes, sir. So the Berlin Conference was 1884, 1885. It was called by the German ruler, von Bismarck. And ultimately, the idea was to establish who was going to get what in Africa. Now, they hadn't done it yet. This was planning to take over Africa and trample on African resistance that they were going to encounter. So if you can imagine a situation where everyone's sitting around the table and you've got this cake called Africa, and this cake is about to be cut up. And in fact, there is a very, very famous, what they call it, satire, a very famous comic where you can see von Bismarck is actually cutting up a cake called Africa. There's another very famous image where you can see one of the Europeans actually standing over Africa. There's a particular, it's almost like you look at what someone's actually stepping on, and it's Africa. And these are very powerful images. So people watching this, Google those images. Von Bismarck cutting up the cake. And the other one, I think it's Henry Morton Stanley standing over Africa. And that's what they were planning to do 1884, 1885. So the people that were planning this, you had people from Britain, people from Austria or Hungary, people from France, Russia, Germany, the United States, Portugal, Denmark, Spain, Italy, Holland, Sweden, Belgium, and Turkey, all sitting around the table planning how they were going to do it. And ultimately, you had a lot of colonial conquest. They didn't all win. There was plenty where Africans fought back, and I'll tell you about some of them. But why Ethiopia was so important, why Adwa was so important, was because this was where it failed. Not only did Africans defeat the European army, but the European army was not able to come back until well after all the other European countries had colonized the countries they were going to colonize in Africa. And that's why Ethiopia is such a powerful symbol of African resistance. That's why so many people outside Africa rate Ethiopia. That's why Ethiopia became such a powerful symbol for the Pan-African movement. So here you have an African nation, not even a nation, an African empire, coming together to defeat colonialism and stop it from happening in their country.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that point that it is seminal in terms of the anti-colonial movement, because it inspired, you know, Africans all over the world. And as you know, and I want you to pick up on that too, because certainly in the diaspora, the first so-called Pan-African conference or Congress was held in 1900. I think it was in London.
That's
Sylvester
right.
Williams certainly was the progenitor, and I think W.E.B. Du Bois was also there. And there's a direct relationship between 1896 and 1900. The word that spread abroad. And there's also a parallel between, the Haitian victory against enslavement in 1804 and the rebellions, etc., within the Caribbean. I think the 1804 conquest by the Haitians of Napoleon's army and the British was so inspirational and led to so many different things in terms of, for example, the Bolivarian Revolution and so on. And we'll get to that down the road. But I just want to compare and contrast those two things in terms of one being a blow against slavery, and in terms of 1896 being a blow against colonialism and giving rise to, certainly in the diaspora as well as on the continent, the anti-colonial movements and the Pan-African movements that started in 1900. Can you pick up on that, Robin?
Yes, sir. One of our colleagues, Danny Thompson, his master's thesis was about this very topic. It was about the movement that was called Ethiopianism. And this was the Black nationalist movement before Pan-Africanism was coined. And the Ethiopianists were inspired by the phrase in the book of Psalms, princes shall come out of Egypt, Ethiopia shall stretch forth her hands unto God. And of course, Ethiopia has two meanings. One of the meanings is a country in East Africa. Another meaning is the whole of Africa. And essentially, this was we wouldn't call it Pan-Africanism because the term Pan-Africanism hadn't been coined yet. But they'd be talking the same stuff that the Pan-Africanists would be talking just a little bit later. So this is the prehistory of Pan-Africanism. And it started in the African-American churches, the AME Church and the AMEZ Church, African Methodist Episcopal Church, African Episcopal Zion Church. And they were sending missionaries and representatives to Southern Africa, West Africa, the Caribbean, and the UK. And then you had these networks of people moving between Black America, the Caribbean, Africa, and England. And ultimately, it was that movement of people that created Pan-Africanism. Now, most people start Pan-Africanism with the Trinidadian barrister, Henry Sylvester Williams. And he was in London in 1896, where he was studying at Gray's Inn. But apparently, we've now found some new information. And the new information is that the idea of even creating such a movement actually started with a Black South African woman called Alice Kinloch, and she was from Cape Town. And she also had business coming to Britain. And apparently Henry Sylvester Williams wrote, and I'm quoting, "The association," meaning the African Association, "is the result of Mrs. Kinloch's work in England and the feelings that as British subjects, we ought to be heard in our own affairs." And then inspired by that, we then get the first Pan-African Congress. No, it wasn't Congress, it was conference, wasn't it? The first Pan-African Conference in 1900. And as you rightly say, you had Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois at that conference. You had Britain's leading Black composer also at that conference. That composer is our local boy. I'm filming this from Croydon in South London, and our local hero is uh, Coleridge, Samuel Coleridge Taylor.
Oh yeah, great.
Yeah,
Poet.
and he was there, and he even wrote music for the event. And then what came out of this? You had Ethiopianist-inspired choirs. You had an Ethiopianist-inspired literature, and in every respect, the choirs, the literature, the discourse, the churches, all of it was the precursor to Pan-Africanism.
Yeah. You're definitely, correct there. And as you were mentioning, Richard Allen, of the created, shall we say, the African Methodist Episcopal, Zion Church, and pulled away from the Methodist Church
Yeah,
itself, which was white, obviously, and which would not allow them to worship with the whites. They had a separate up in the balcony for black people, and of course they were insulted by that and separated and created a different church. And then some of the other people that you were referring to were people like Blyden and people like Robert Love,
yeah,
who were some were born in Africa, some were born in the Caribbean, but they went from the Caribbean to Liberia, to Sierra Leone, and to England, and some of them were missionaries, etc. So there was
yeah,
a whole period there, as you're mentioning, before the 1900s, when all of this was happening. And I can't remember the American who had this trip to the Congo, where he was investigating the Congo.
George Washington Williams.
Okay, there you go. Ross Worm, I think, was also one of those
Yeah,
people. So there's a whole period there of different, the ideas were germinating in
yeah,
terms of African expression, coming out of the period of slavery, and how do we reconstitute ourselves, and then getting towards that 1900 conference, and then subsequent conferences leading up, of course, to 1945, which was also seminal, but also leading up to my dad, which was important. It's interesting that you mentioned the Psalm, "Princes shall come out of Egypt, and Ethiopia shall stretch forth her hands unto God." This was one of my dad's favorite quotations, and I think it's important also that you mentioned that Ethiopia is both the continent as well as the country, which
yeah,
ended up being called Abyssinia at one time, and then came to be called Ethiopia. I'm not sure of what the sequence was when it became Abyssinia. But I think what has happened over time is that you had some groups who identified Ethiopia with Abyssinia,
yeah,
meaning that the whole historicity in terms of the nation state.
yeah,
And of course, my dad's vision of Ethiopia was all of Africa,
yeah,
which is the way other people saw Africa, because Ethiopia originally, I think, meant dark skin or burnt faces, however you want to describe that.
yeah,
And that Ethiopia originally also was not only the continental Africa, but India. Some people call India Ethiopia,
yeah,
Eastern Ethiopia. Can,
yeah.
can you can you take us through Ethiopia and Abyssinia and back to Ethiopia?
Yeah, sometimes when the historians are talking about Ethiopia, sometimes they mean one country in Africa.
Mhm.
Now, which country? On a modern map, it wouldn't actually be modern Ethiopia. It would be closer to modern Sudan.
Mhm.
But when people talk about Ethiopia and its role as the originator of civilization, what they mean by that on a modern map would be where Sudan is today.
Mhm.
And that area was the site where you had the very first kingdom in the world, the kingdom of Tar-Seti. Tar-Seti, Tar is land, Seti is south. Some people say Seti also means bow, as in bow and arrow. So Tar-Seti, the land of the bow and arrow. And that is your first kingdom on earth. Archaeologists have found a dynasty of 12 rulers of Tar-Seti who ruled before Egypt's first pharaoh, or to be exact, 11 of them ruled before Egypt's first pharaoh. And the last one was contemporaneous with Egypt's first pharaoh, right? So that's one use. Then we've got Ethiopia, meaning, as you say.
Just take a pin as you would say. How does that relate to Kush and to Nubia?
Okay, Kush is the same area, but later on.
Later, okay, good.
So by the time we get to around Egypt's sixth dynasty, which is the end of the Old Kingdom period, right? A new polity, if you like, emerges in the Sudan region, and that polity is now being called Kush. And its capital city, the archaeologists have been excavating it for the last 10, 15, 20 years. The capital city was called Kerma. And this was the famous nation state, then empire state of Kush. And then it has its golden age, contemporaneous with Egypt's sixth dynasty, all the way up to Egypt's 18th dynasty. So when Egypt was doing its 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, all the way up to 18, this was the golden age of Kush. Then Egypt collapses, and it collapses round about the end of the 20th dynasty, 20th, 21st, 22nd, that type of period. Then Kush was back. And these are the Kushite pharaohs that everybody knows: Taharqa, Shabaka, Tanwetanami, all of those type of people, yeah? But that's late. And that's, again, the region is again being called Kush. Now, in European records, such as the records of the Greeks, they always call this same place, they called it Ethiopia, right? Now, the country that we call Ethiopia today, much further south and further east in the Horn of Africa, it's connected to Kush. I've since seen some archaeological evidence that says that the Kushites had a presence there. But the first kingdom to emerge was a kingdom called Damot. Then there was another kingdom that emerged called Aksum. And then by the time we get into the Middle Ages, this kingdom is being called Abyssinia. But again, in some of the European records, they're also calling it Ethiopia as well. Do you see? Yeah. And of course, in the 20th century, they reclaimed the name Ethiopia. Yeah. And what then happened is because of Ethiopia's role in standing up to the Italians and not being beaten at Adwa, that raised Ethiopia's status very, very high. And kings like Menelik II, he was looked up to as, you know, that's the kind of African ruler we want to see. That type of mentality happened. And then, of course, the next period where Ethiopia is being bigged up was with the birth of Rastafari. And I think Rastafari starts in 1930 with 4 Jamaican priests. And your father is alleged to have said something to the effect of, "Look to the east, where a king shall be crowned, he will be the redeemer." I don't know if that was ever said, but that legend says your dad said that. So people were looking to the east, and then a black king was indeed crowned, and he was indeed a tribe of Judah and conquering lion and all this kind of stuff. So, and on his vestiture and on his name, on his thigh, a name, King of Kings, etc., etc. So everyone then thought, oh, that's the prophecy. And then that created Rastafari. And then with it, Ethiopia, the modern country called Ethiopia, its status has then been again raised in the African consciousness. And then, of course, the fact being that after World War II, Haile Selassie, the Emperor of Ethiopia, stepped very, very correct. He didn't necessarily step correct before that, but after World War II.
Let's go back to where we stopped off before.
Yeah.
Because, okay, we were at the Battle of Adwa,
Yeah.
and the Italians were defeated in 1896.
Yeah.
But of course, they never gave up that idea of conquest in Africa and
Yeah.
having territory there.
Yeah.
And they felt that that defeat had to be defended. The defeat had to be reversed, if you will.
Yeah.
So they came back in 1935 now with Benito Mussolini. Can you take us into 1935 and then Second World War, etc. and Selassie?
Yeah. In 1935, Italy was now under fascist rule. So, and the fascist leader was Benito Mussolini, and he saw himself in many respects as a reincarnation of the ancient Roman emperors. So the whole Roman salute became the fascist salute. And he wanted to restore that old Roman glory. So one of the things that they did was to conquer Ethiopia. And this time they had the aircraft that could do the bombings, the poison gas, the genocide. They were able to do a lot of horrible things. But what the fascist invasion of Ethiopia did was it galvanized Black people from all over the world. Jomo Kenyatta wrote Facing Mount Kenya, and he mentions the crisis, and he mentioned how appalled and outraged he was that an ancient Black kingdom was being overthrown by fascists. You had Nigerians in London forming the Abyssinian Association, again, to galvanize the Nigerians that were in London against this outrage. You had African Americans, you had so-called West Indians, you had all these different Black people forming different associations to support Ethiopia. But
Ethiopian World Federation came out of that too.
Yeah. And the result of that was, of course, Shashamane. Yeah. So yeah, so consequently, there was a lot. So in other words, you could argue historically that the invasion by the fascists of Ethiopia put Black people all over the world on the same page because of this crisis. Now, the one group of people that didn't represent were the people in Ethiopia. Some of them rebuffing the attempts to help them from other Blacks, because at this time, ideology was spreading that Ethiopians aren't actually Africans, they are Hamites, they are Semites, and all this kind of foolishness. And that seriously damaged the reputation of Ethiopia, seriously damaged. And it was only really after World War II, when Haile Selassie stepped very, very correctly, that the reputation of Ethiopia went back up again. But that time period, 1935, Ethiopians didn't represent. They represented in 1896, but they didn't represent then, you know?
That's an interesting, shall we say, almost transformation, because also at that time, Eritrea, in a sense, belonged to the Italians, as did Somalia.
Yeah, yeah.
So it was only Ethiopia that was still standing up, so to speak, in the Horn of Africa.
Yeah, you're right. And as some Eritreans remind me, yes, Ethiopia defeated the Italians at Adwa, but the Italians still kept Eritrea, you know?
So again, you know, let's go back to how Mussolini was defeated. He was really defeated by the Allies in terms of the whole World War II effort.
Yeah.
Across North Africa and East Africa, the Allies rebuffed him.
Yeah.
And Haile Selassie at that point in time spent his time in exile
Yeah.
um, in Bath in England. And as
Yeah.
a matter of fact, I visited the house where he stayed. He has since deeded the house to the community, and a
Yeah.
lot of the Rastafarians, as you mentioned, occupied it or taking care of it, etc., etc. But his role,
Can I ask a question here, sir?
I just want to make a point. His role was more a diplomatic role
Yeah.
than the role of a warrior, such as
Yeah.
Menelik.
Yeah.
There was quite a distinction there.
Yeah, can I just jump in here, sir? Because I gather, but I don't have the proof, but maybe you're aware of the proof. I gather that when the emperor was in Britain, he had a Black Caribbean speechwriter who was female. Do you know about this, sir?
No, I'm not aware of that. No.
Yeah. And the reason why is I see, I'm trying to get the facts on this. So anyone watching this, put the facts in the, type underneath the presentation. So I'm trying to get the facts on this because I'm trying to track down who that woman was.
Mm-hmm.
Because I suspect you are an emperor, you're in Britain. As far as you're concerned, you're Hamito-Semitic, something, 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 so you're not African. And you come up against anti-Black racism for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to change your perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the theory that I'm working on is that's why my man stepped a lot more correct after World War II. Do you see?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interesting, yes, because you are correct in stating that there was a period when whether the Ethiopians were thinking that themselves or it was a propaganda move from the forces that tried to divide Africans, that this whole business of the Ethiopians being Hamites
Yeah.
or Shemites, meaning Semites,
Mm-hmm.
really being truly, quote, Negro, whatever that means.
Yeah.
These are all, acronyms, shall we say, words used by the dominant group to define us in any way they want to define us
True
at
say.
any particular, point in time. The question is whether the Kool-Aid was totally, imbibed by the Ethiopians themselves. And this is something that, you don't really know because it depends on who you talk to or who you meet at what period of time and whether it's a minority opinion or a majority opinion. But that was out there. And I think that was also one of the criticisms of my dad, and in terms of Ethiopians really reaching out to the Black diaspora in terms of assistance during that second invasion, in terms of 1935. And I think in response to that, then they created the Ethiopian World Federation in terms of that criticism. But it was a dispute that was going on during that period.
Yeah. But to be fair to Ethiopia, they're the only country that has cut off a piece of land for the diaspora and say, here, have that. Yeah. And I'd like to see other African countries be doing exactly that, cut off a piece of land and say, hey, that's yours. You can take that.
Another relationship, shall we say, between, the emperor and the diaspora. There were two pilots, one of whom was Hewlett Jack, which was an African American, and his plane was supported by my dad, and he was attempting to fly to Ethiopia, and I think he did get there, etc., and contributed to the Ethiopian Air Force initially. But then there was another gentleman, I think his name was Johnson, but you can correct me. He ended up being, and of course he was also an African American, and I was just there at Ethiopian Airlines and took a picture with his bus that's there.
His boss is there.
Yes, his bus is there,
Respect.
at the headquarters of the Ethiopian Aviation University. Um,
Mhm.
um, but he used to fly the plane of Emperor Haile Selassie, and he really was, shall we say, important in
Yeah.
starting the whole Air Force of Ethiopia, Ethiopian Airlines, and
Mhm. Mhm.
and that's memorialized by his statue that is there. So
Yeah.
Ethiopian Airlines got its start from a diaspora person who went to Ethiopia during
Mhm.
that period in 1935, I guess going on to 40, etc.,
Yeah.
and the end of World War II, and helping to establish the Ethiopian Airlines, and that is acknowledged,
Yeah.
the hierarchy of Ethiopian Airlines, and of course the government itself.
No, well said, sir. Well said.
Yeah, our history is very wonderful in terms of the resistance, not only the resistance but the triumphs, and we don't often recognize the triumphs, and we tend to emphasize the defeats, because again, that is what the propaganda machine of the people who oppress us keep telling us. We were defeated here, and we were defeated here, and we were defeated there. But
Can I
we have,
jump in there, sir?
yeah, please, yeah.
And this is why because here's the thing. Um, at approximately the same period, the British tried to take over Sudan.
Mm,
And during that same period, the Sudanese were rebelled under Mohammed Ahmed, also known as the Mahdi.
yes.
And essentially, 1882 is when they kicked off, 1884, all the way up to 1885. They actually destroyed British rule in Sudan. Now, the Brits came back, but the main point is that was a victory initially. Now, of course, when the Brits came back, they came back with machine guns and all the rest of it. But the point being is that the Mahdist rebellion in Sudan could have been, we could have been talking about it had the Brits not come back with machine guns. Do you see?
Yeah.
And the same thing goes with in South Africa, in Zululand.
Mhm.
You had, of course, the Battle of Isandlwana, when the Zulus destroyed a British army in less than 2 hours.
Mm.
And again, it's only when they came back with machine guns, yeah, or the Maxim gun. So these are examples. In other words, the idea that the conquering European powers were all powerful during the colonial period. No, they weren't.
Yes, yes. I think that's important for us to recognize. And it's the same way with our heroes. We have to recognize who our heroes are, because very often the European powers try to give us heroes,
It's
but
true.
it's the people who have collaborated with them that they're giving us as our heroes. So they distort, history. They distort, the reality of our experiences and their experiences. So the
Yeah.
whole thing is an illusion, and is kept alive by propaganda.
Yeah.
I mean, just to get up to the current phase now, they're still telling you that somehow the Ukrainians are going to beat the Russians. It's a total
Mhm.
impossibility. The Ukraine
Mhm.
is being destroyed on a daily basis. They're
Yeah.
still telling you that Israel has some right, because Hamas initiated some sort of an attack. Israel has
Mhm.
a right to commit genocide. Nobody
Mhm.
has a right to commit genocide, but you put out your propaganda machine, and it has nothing to do with truth. It has nothing to do with honesty. It has nothing to do with ethics. It has
Yeah.
nothing to do with international law.
Yeah.
And you know, it's important for us to see this, that
Yeah.
the whole facade of European civilization is nothing but a facade. It's
Yeah.
based on lies.
Mhm.
It's based on a distortion of historical fact.
Yeah.
And it's based on a distortion of who they are and what they have done. And the damage that Churchill, did to the Indians in Bengal, the
Mhm.
damage that he did to Sudan, etc. And African people all over the world.
Yeah.
But of course, he's a European hero. Truman is a
Not only that, what's really, really strange is that I don't know if you're aware of this, but there's a joke that white British people have
Mhm.
that black British people have the common name Winston.
By the
Yeah.
way, my middle name is Winston. I'm Julius Winston.
Right. Now, can you see that the amount of us that were almost certainly named after Winston Churchill? Now, how
I
ironic.
think my Winston came before Churchill, though, I think.
That's
Because I was born in 1933, and Winston came came alive in the 1940s, maybe. I'm not sure, but whatever.
yeah, yeah.
I don't want it to be said that I was named after Winston. But continue your point.
Yeah, so basically, there was a generation of Black Caribbean men who were named after Winston Churchill. Now, how ironic is that?
Yes, yes. All of us bear these names. The Cecil Rhodes and the Rhodes Scholarship, all of these things that we admire. But all
Yeah,
of that is built on the backs of theft and abuse of Native African people.
yeah. Yeah, so the other thing too is I think the importance of Adwa, which I think needs to be stressed,
Yeah.
is when I was in Ethiopia in December, we made a trip to Southwest Ethiopia, to the lands of Oromo, to the lands of the Maji, to the lands of the Bench, countries that weren't a part of Ethiopia back in the day. So when people were talking about the great civilization of Aksum, the great civilization of Lalibela, the great period of Gondar, these places were not a part of Ethiopia.
Mm.
They were actually separate countries. And then during the time of Menelik and some of the earlier rulers, they conquered these lands and brought them into the Ethiopian Empire. So Ethiopia is quite a, if you like, a disparate set of kingdoms that were brought together as an empire. But what they're all proud of, and this is where Adwa comes in, what they're all proud of is the roles that the different kingdoms played in coming together to defeat a conquering power. And so I'm aware that Ethiopia is about to be doing a whole bunch of celebrations to and they make it a point of marking the Adwa things, an important part of their calendar. And Ethiopia has been engaged in other Pan-African activities, such as the ones that you're involved in and I'm involved in. So if you want to say something about your trip, was it a week ago, 2 weeks ago?
Well, in some sense, it's better for you to talk about your December trip, because my trip 2 weeks ago is sort of subsequent to the formation of a group that you participated in and you're a part of in terms of creating it, the Global Black Center for Education, Heritage, and Culture. And I think it's a phenomenal event, really, and I think it's important. Number one, it has a global perspective. And number two, it's dealing with, shall we say, Black African civilization, not to exclude anyone, but to focus on our accomplishments over time, being the first people and the first Homo sapiens were Black. So that is what has to be promoted in terms of the actual history, traditions, and culture of humanity. And that's what has been distorted. So there's a significant role that this organization, has to play. And the fact that it is domiciled in Ethiopia, and the fact that it has been created around the time of the celebration of the victory at Adwa, I think is significant because it plays into the whole Pan-African, ideology. Because again, also the African Union is in Addis, and of course, Emperor Haile Selassie was foundational, along with several other leaders such as Kwame Nkrumah, Sekou Touré, etc. In the foundation on the formation of the Organization of African Unity back in what was it, 63, I
Yeah.
think. So there's that continuity, from that again into the African Union, which I think that transition was 2001. So there's progress in terms of the centralization of policy making and in some sense global vision in terms of the OAU becoming the AU, and of course it has to become the Federated States of Africa, linking all 54 states, and also with the diaspora as the sixth region.
Yeah.
A lot of moves have been made in terms of CARICOM and the AU, but it's broader than CARICOM in terms of the diaspora. CARICOM is those 15 countries in the Caribbean, but there's an African presence outside of the 15 countries, such as in the United States, such as in Central America, such as in Mexico, such as in South America, Brazil, etc.
Yeah.
So, the whole concept has to be global. We're a global people, and I think my father gave us that understanding of Africans as a nation globally. Africa for the Africans, those at home and those abroad. So the formation of that organization, I think is key, because it, again, with it being domiciled in Addis, it rekindles that whole spirit of Adwa, that spirit that was of an Africa that was never conquered.
Yeah.
And that we're now building on that spirit, as my father would say, redeem Africa. We can say reconstruct African civilization based on our own traditions that go back all the way to ancient Ethiopia, Kush, Nubia, Nile Valley civilization, and Kemet. But I'm interested in your perspective on this, because you're one of the founders.
Yeah, the vision that we had was very different to the vision that many heritage institutions in African countries have. If you visit any one African country, the only heritage they have is what's in that country. They don't have any of the heritage of their neighbors. And so what happens is, if you're from Ethiopia, you know that your ancestors carved a city of underground churches out of the ground. You know that your people did that. You don't know that your neighbors in Kenya in medieval times were living in 3, 4, and 5-story houses on the East African coast. They don't know that. And what? They had that? Same thing. Ethiopians know that, they've had writing systems going back 3,000 years to the kingdom of Damot, where you've got the Proto-Ethiopic script, which some people say is the parent of the Sabaean script. Some people say the Sabaean script is its ancestor, whichever way around the debate's ongoing. But places like Sudan have had writing also going back thousands and thousands of years. And there have been archives that have been discovered in Sudan where they found documents cutting across 7 or 8 different languages. So there's an archive that was found at a site called Kazir Ibrim, and they found documents in Meroitic, Old Nubian, Coptic, Arabic, Latin, Turkish, Greek, and Greek Creole, which was halfway between Greek and Nubian. Now, what I'm saying is, and here's the vision now, in this center of education, Africans from all over need to know this. Africans from all over need to know the achievements of Black people in Brazil, runaway slaves creating their own kingdom, the Kingdom of Palmares. That should be common knowledge on the African continent. African Americans, 1.5 generations away from slavery, creating the Harlem Renaissance. And it wasn't just African Americans. As you know, your dad was a part of that. Dr. Du Bois was a part of that. The king of music at the time, Duke Ellington, was a part of that. Louis Armstrong, the greatest
poet, yeah. Jamaican, yeah.
Yeah. So consequently, everybody in Africa needs to know that. That should be common knowledge. And so we want then the history to be genuinely Pan-African. We want the artifacts to be genuinely Pan-African. Not what did Ethiopia create that contributed to the story. Already heritage institutions in Ethiopia do that. We want so that every Ethiopian knows about the fine art that came out of Ife in Yoruba land, Nigeria. Every Ethiopian needs to know that. Those types of artifacts should be there. And so the idea then is to revolutionize heritage education in Africa so it genuinely becomes a Pan-African experience. And see, when you don't make it Pan-African, a lot of people in one part of Africa think, well, their heritage is better than anybody else's in Africa because they have no idea what other Africans have. No idea. And similarly, a lot of people in Africa have no idea what heritage those Black people that got captured and dragged away to the Americas, they have no idea what heritage those people have. And we need to bring it all into one center. And that's really what our vision is.
Well, I think that's a magnificent vision. I think it's consistent with my father's vision of one people, you know, with one history and one set of traditions, however they develop over time. But they have the same basis, which is a spiritual basis that is balanced with the material, not simply a material basis, which is the Eurocentric perspective, which takes us into the violation of humanity and the violation of nature itself. I think what you've just been describing in terms of a mission statement, shall we say, is extremely necessary, because it's only through an educational process that we can change the mindset of African people. And the battle in the future is for the minds of the young people, because it's the young people that, of course, inherit the world. But if they inherit it with the same mindset of this generation or previous generation, then you're just going to get a repetition of what has gone on before.
True say.
Of African people, the colonization of Africa, and neocolonialism, and the perpetuation of imperialism over time. So it's important for us to capture the minds of our young people through a holistic educational process that will educate the African human being really to be African, whether he lives in the diaspora or on the continent. So I'm wholeheartedly supportive of such an effort.
Thank you very much, sir. And we're really, really pleased that you've taken on that role. Yeah, big things are about to happen.
Wonderful. I think that's a good note, for us to end upon. But we will continue our discourse, because this whole idea of getting a handle of the wonders of African history, and the fact that we have continually fought against invasion, against oppression, against distortion of who we are. I think it's important for us to share this with our audience that is looking. And I would say I want us to go to Haiti, and what that means, or what that meant in terms of the Caribbean, and what that meant in terms of the fight against slavery, and the fight for freedom, not only in Haiti, not only in the Caribbean, but throughout all of Latin America, because it also inspired the Bolivarian Revolution. So I look forward to that as our next topic, shall we say, that we will discuss. As usual,
Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, sir.
Until next time.